Okay, this presentation was done at The Ohio State University. This is for our Ratio Christi Campus Apologetics Alliance chapter there. And this presentation is called How to Doubt Your Doubts, God's Existence and the Quest for Certainty. So there are more than enough resources that have been written about this topic. There's a couple of them here that are available online for free. You can read some of these online for free. On the right side here, Dealing with Doubt and the Thomas Factor. Both of these books are written by Gary Habermas. They are on his website. You can just type those titles in. You can read those books for free. You can download them. He's made them available to the public. Habermas he's a resurrection apologist and also New Testament scholar. So those are two really good free online sources. And then Bobby Conway's book, Doubting Towards Faith, is something that came out just a couple years ago. That is not free online, but you can pick that up on Amazon. Some other resources, an older one here is Proper Confidence, Faith and Doubt and Certainty in Christian Discipleship. And then on the far right here is Alistair McGrath's book called Doubting, Growing Through the Uncertainties of Faith. So there are some resources here. If you want to go deeper on this topic, I encourage you to do so. I especially would advise you take advantage of those two free online sources by Habermas. A couple quotes here. One is by Os Guinness. He says there we live in an age of doubt, disillusion, and disaffiliation, which naturally prizes what has been described as the faith that you go to when you don't know where to go. Both our pluralistic and secularized culture has produced a fragilized self as it pertains to doubt. No doubt that is a true quote. Another quote by C.S. Lewis. He once said, "Now that I am a Christian, I do have moods in which the whole thing looks very improbable. But when I was an atheist, I had moods in which Christianity looked terribly probable." That's from his book, Mere Christianity. Now, when Bobby Conway wrote this book called Doubting Towards Faith, he was asked why would he write this book, and he says right here, "Do we really need a whole book on doubt? Is this really a huge issue in the church today?" In a word, yes, it really is. He says we live in a multi-texture culture that is replete with innumerable beliefs, opinions, ideas, and life philosophies. Ours is a culture of doubt and longing, faith and questioning, searching and probing. And much of the doubt has been accelerated by fast-paced change. Our culture is living between the tension of what we once were and what we are now becoming. I think that quote is right on, and I do agree with him that there does need to be resources on this topic. Now, in the book, You Lost Me, Why Young Christians Are Leaving the Church and Rethinking Church, this was written back in, I think, 2007 or 2008 by David Kinnaman. He has this quote here in his book. He says, "Young adults with Christian experience say the church is not a place that allows them to express doubts. They do not feel safe admitting that sometimes Christianity does not make sense. In addition, many feel that the church's response to doubt is trivial. Some of the perceptions in this regard include not being able to ask my most pressing life questions in church, 36% said that, and having significant intellectual doubts about my faith, 23% said that. And a related theme of how churches struggle to help young adults who feel marginalized, about 1 out of every 6 young adults with a Christian background said their faith does not help with depression or other emotional problems they experience. 18% said that. Now, part of the problem is a lot of Christians do not know how to express their doubts. They're afraid if they do express them to other Christians, they will get a negative response, because sometimes doubt is expressed as something that's dealing with perplexity, worry, uncertainty, or perhaps weak faith. And so, unfortunately, within the churches, we come up with poor responses to doubt. And one of the things that really hurts Christians with doubt is what I would call a brittle fundamentalism. And if you are raised in a church that kind of is that has a very brittle fundamentalistic atmosphere, I know that sounds kind of, you're probably saying, what does that even mean? Well, if you were raised in that atmosphere, you're in one now. In some cases, people within these churches aren't allowed to ask any questions. Sometimes these kind of churches insulate their people, or they over-insulate them. They try to protect them from anything that might cause them to question anything. And so this creates a climate of fear. And then in many cases, a lot of times Christians are given overly simplistic answers to very complex questions. For example, Sometimes the answers that they get or the responses they get when they express doubt are, you just need to pray about it, or you must have secret sin in your life, or perhaps you just think too much, or Jesus said we just need to have the faith of a child, or faith is about heart knowledge and not head knowledge. So responses like these right here do not help people with doubt. They just make it worse, and unfortunately many churches do say these things. It doesn't mean that Christians who say them are bad people. It just means that they don't know how to handle people that have doubts, and they don't know how to deal with their own doubts. So in many cases, these are just the answers we give to people, but they're not helping the situation. So a lot of times a brittle or kind of rigid fundamentalism can lead to doubt, despair, and departure. That means that many people with doubt run into despair. They don't know where to turn. Eventually, they just leave the church or leave Christianity in general. So it doesn't always happen, but some cases it does happen. So these are called the 3 Ds: doubt, despair, and departure. Now, a couple authors have written about the problem with trying to find a absolute certainty for beliefs. One of these is Gregory Boyd's book, The Benefit of the Doubt, Breaking the Idol Certainty. And William Lane Craig says here about the issue of doubt. He says here, the secret to living with doubt in the Christian life is not to resolve all of one's doubts. One will always have unanswered questions. Rather, the secret is learning to live victoriously with one's unanswered questions. And we need to remember that asking questions is not the same thing as necessarily having doubt. I think in some cases we assume if you have a question about anything that you must be doubting it, and that's not necessarily true. For example, if I have questions about the Trinity and I don't understand the Trinity completely, that doesn't mean I'm doubting it. It just means I don't understand it. So this happens with a lot of things, and we need to understand that having questions is not the same thing as having doubts. We also need to remember that every single belief system has its questions. Asking questions is part of the human story. Now, is there anything positive about doubt? Someone might say, no, doubt's all negative and it's sin, but most people do believe this. They practice it all the time. We know that doubt prevents us from reaching hasty conclusions or making commitments to unreliable or untrustworthy sources. Obviously, a suspension of judgment until sufficient inquiry is made and adequate evidence is presented helps us to make good decisions. So we do exercise doubt in a lot of areas of life, and especially when it comes to religious beliefs. We all know that we are probably doubters about Mormonism, Islam, atheism, spiritualism, many other world religions. And I do believe if a Mormon came to your door and asked you to convert to Mormonism, or a Jehovah's Witness came to your door and asked you to convert to what they believe, you probably would have a lot of doubts and you throw up a lot of questions and you would doubt their claim, especially Islam. If Islam says Jesus never died, which is what the Quran says, you probably would have a lot of doubts about that. So in one way, all Christians are doubters when it comes to exploring different beliefs out there. Like I said, if a Muslim tries to convince me Islam is based on a true revelation, I have plenty of doubts that that claim is true, because there's just too many resources that testify the fact that Jesus was a real person who died in the 1st century on a Roman crucifixion stake. So of course I'm going to exercise doubt with Islam, and we do that with other beliefs as well. Now in the Bible, there are plenty of places where people doubt. We do know that, of course, James talks about this in James 1:5-8, that when someone's asking for wisdom, if we don't ask in faith, we end up being double-minded. And in that case, that's not the form of doubt we want to exercise there. And of course, also Jude instructs believers to have mercy on doubters in Jude 22, who had been attacked by false teachers. Matthew, of course, talks about Jesus' followers doubting him on one occasion, and we know that there are many cases in the Bible where people struggled to obey God and they didn't have strong faith and they doubted. Now, we'll talk about that kind of doubt in a minute, but we just need to understand the Bible is filled with examples of people that doubted. I already talked about that. We'll go ahead and skip that one. And we'll go ahead and skip the part about Steve Jobs. Okay, so let's talk about the various kinds of doubt that generally cause problems for us. There is what's called emotional doubt, factual doubt, and volitional doubt. Now, when it comes to emotional doubt, this has to do more with our mood swings and how we feel, of course. And in some cases in our Christian life, we may just have questions about God's presence, his goodness, or we may be encountering unanswered prayer. Or in many cases, we just have wrong expectations of God. We assume God is supposed to do something in our lives, a certain area, and then when it doesn't happen, we begin to really doubt the goodness of God. And so in many cases, our emotions can be up and down. That's just part of life because we are wired emotionally. We're not just purely intellectual or purely emotional. We're a combination of all kinds of things. But one thing for sure, emotions can go up and down depending on circumstances. Emotions obviously can cause fear, and they cause us to ask questions like, what if I'm really not a believer? Or what if God doesn't forgive me for some specific sin in my life? Or how could God allow my child to be diagnosed with cancer or something else? Of course, when tragedy strikes, we definitely doubt the goodness of God. That's just part of the human makeup. Other questions: will God provide for our financial needs? What if I stay single my entire life? Of course, some people ask, why did you make me this way, if they're afflicted with a depression or mental illness or something else. And in many cases, some people doubt the goodness of God and they're emotionally down if they're not a success in life. If they're not going by the American dream standard, they can be viewed as a failure. So these are the kinds of things that trigger our emotions and cause us to doubt emotionally, or whether God is there, whether his presence is there, whether he's just good. And in many cases, a lot of this revolves around not knowing the God who is. That means that we are not studying the scriptures. We're not really good on the character of God. We don't know what God's like. And perhaps we've just come up with a God in our mind that's made up. And we need to not mix the American dream with our faith, because God's purpose in life, or we sometimes assume God's purpose is just to make us happy. This is what's talked about in the book, The Lost Virtue of Happiness by J.P. Moreland and Claus Isler. They say here, do you want to be happy? If you're an American, it's overwhelmingly likely that you do. We Americans are obsessed with being happy, but we are terribly confused about happiness is. As a result, we seldom find a happiness that lasts. But because the pursuit of happiness is promised to us as a right in the founding document of our nation, the Declaration of Independence, we carry a sense of entitlement. We think we deserve happiness. And if we look on the right side here, this is a classical view of happiness. It's not based on an intense feeling on the left side here. In the classical view, happiness comes from a settled tone. It's from following the Lord. And it comes from a more permanent or stable well-being. And if we take it on the other side, we go by our feelings, obviously our happiness is going to be up and down. And like I said, a circumstantial faith can cause us not to be happy. And if any of these things are removed or threatened, sometimes God is just not good. If our career is threatened, or a certain relationship or possessions or our various roles in life, we can end up simply having a circumstantial faith. Now, how do we get through emotional doubt? Well, one thing that really helps is our knowledge. What do we know? And if you don't have a good knowledge base about what you know, your emotions are going to be all over the place, and you cannot live your faith on emotion alone. So knowledge can be the key thing as to what keeps you close to God over the long haul. If you rely on your emotions alone and you have no knowledge, you have all kinds of problems. In some cases, you need to say to yourself, I know what God says about me. I know the promises of God. Now, obviously, that goes back to knowing the scriptures and believing the scriptures are true. We'll talk about factual doubt in a minute. But knowledge is very important to having a lifelong lasting faith. And of course, when it comes to feeling certain about your faith and being certain, these are two different things. Because Bobby Conway talks about this in his book. Someone came to him and said, but Bobby, I feel 100% certain that Christianity is true. And he says, and I would add, we certainly cannot confuse feeling certain and being certain. There's a difference. Mormons also feel certain their beliefs are true, as do Muslim, atheists, and many others. But feeling certain and being certain aren't necessarily equivalent. And we need to understand that the Holy Spirit will give us the assurance our faith is true, but when it comes to being certain, that comes through facts and evidence, and then that moves into the area of factual doubt. And once again, remember, wisdom is the application of knowledge. You can't apply what you don't know. So if you're not soaking your mind in the scriptures and you're not knowing the way God acts in the history of the Bible, then you're going to have a hard time knowing what to apply because there's nothing in your mind to apply because you don't have any knowledge. And remember, when it comes to overcoming emotional doubt, we need to remember we have to rely upon truth because truth is what changes us, not our feelings. Truth comes through the Word of God. It comes sometimes through suffering and struggle. It comes through being in community. It comes through prayer. But truth is what changes us. So if you are not dependent on the truth, or you don't know what the truth is, or you're not soaking your mind in the truth, and you're not in community where you can hear truth, you're going to have a hard time experiencing transformation. A big trigger to sin, or a big trigger to doubt, sometimes it's overlooked, is sin itself. Sometimes we don't understand the power of sin and what it can do to us, because the more we willfully sin, the more hardened and callous our heart will become. And in some cases, we just become desensitized to the things of God. And the Bible warns about having a seared conscience. That means a conscience that is not sensitive to the things of God. So there's no doubt that sin itself will lead to serious doubt problems. Many people don't understand that. They think they can willfully sin and not have a hard problem with doubting God. And it just doesn't work that way. So don't forget how sin can trigger doubt. This is talked about in the book The Making of an Atheist by James Spiegel. He has a book called The Making of an Atheist, How Immorality Leads to Unbelief. You can read that book. It's for like $2.99 on Kindle right now. So what happens is sometimes this pattern is that when you go from doubt to unbelief is that you start with a hardened heart where the sin is beginning to harden your heart. Sometimes you might go through an experience in your life where you're disappointed with God. And then you have an issue with factual doubt where you're doubting the factuality of the Bible or God's existence or the resurrection of Jesus or something else. And then you're not spiritually disciplined in your life. That means that you are not in prayer, you're not in the Word, you're not in community, you're not doing anything spiritually to stay strong in the Lord. And all these things will contribute eventually to unbelief. So remember the pattern here. Remember what you need to do to stay above these things and to catch these things when they are manifested in your life. Now let's talk about intellectual or factual doubt. This, of course, has to do with questions about God's existence, the reliability of the Bible, or the resurrection. Of course, we've all heard the statement, the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. That's very true. That's why so many believers are extremely bold, because they may not know much, but they are bold. So obviously we can't learn every single thing, but I do have some tips for the issues of factual doubt. Remember that the internet is a huge problem today because many people are just clicking on websites or YouTube clips, and they're assuming that anyone and everyone's an expert on any given topic. And so if you Google something, you may think, well, this is a new argument that nobody has ever heard before, but you'd be surprised. It probably is not a new argument. And of course, many people can go on the internet and they can find people say they're ex-Christians. But remember, there's much more to it that meets the eye than simply Googling something online. And a lot of times when you Google something online, when you find something that makes you uncomfortable, you have this issue of cognitive dissonance. And this means that when you see something that triggers something in your mind, you thought you always believed something was true or this way or that way, and you're hearing counter evidence, you experience this dissonance in your mind. You have to figure out how to deal with that dissonance. Now, everybody has that. Atheists have that as well. Skeptics have the same thing. But in many cases, a lot of people are not able to figure out how to deal with the dissonance. They either go out and find answers, or else they just live with the dissonance all throughout their lives. And of course, a lot of these arguments on here on this bad atheist argument bingo board, a lot of people assume these are slam dunks to refute Christianity, but that is just not the case, because many of these objections here have been answered. If you've not heard any answers, then you simply aren't working hard enough. So I would never be a skeptic or atheist because of any of these objections. A lot of them have been dealt with over the last 2,000 years. And in some cases, some skeptics or atheists assume that no evidence ever accounts for God's existence, and so sometimes they just go in the circular argument with Christians, where they keep asking for evidence, and then you present evidence, and they say that's not evidence. And so I do not let atheists do this to me anymore, because I just have them define evidence. If you can define what evidence is, it will really help the conversation. Also, if this is what you believe and you assume that this is already settled and there's just so much evidence for it, then I advise you to do a little more research. So this is a general overview of how a secularist or naturalist or an atheist might believe we got here. The laws of physics for our present universe arose by chance from a multitude of possible universes. The first forms of life developed by chance, arising from primordial soup combinations that resulted from the laws of physics plus accidents. The first concept of life developed purely by chance through genetic mutations and environmental randomness, and humans evolved by more improbable occurrences. So to summarize, the view of how we got here is human life equals laws of physics times chance plus randomness plus accidents plus luck plus 3.5 billion years. Now, this is a view that is taught on college campuses. This is a very generalized overview, of course, but just remember that there is more than enough evidence to show the problems with this, but some people assume that this is a slam dunk to how we got here, and I can tell you that this is challenged and is being challenged more and more every day. So for skeptics to say there's no evidence for God, it really boils down to them not having a good epistemology. Epistemology is a study of knowledge and how we arrive to knowledge, how we know things. In many cases, they don't know how to define evidence and they don't know the basics of logic. They may not know the difference between an inductive, abductive, or deductive argument. So just remember that a lot of it revolves around epistemology. That's why I recommend these books. If you want to learn the basics of epistemology, you can pick up one of these. These are all some general introductions. And I highly doubt that anybody that's read any of these books right here would walk away saying there's absolutely no evidence for God whatsoever, such as Blackwell's Companion to Natural Theology or J. Warner Wallace's God's Crime Scene or Debating Christian Theism, or Edward Fazer's books here, or Robert Spitzer's book on the far right. If you read all those books all the way through and assume there's no evidence for God whatsoever, then all I can tell you is you don't know what evidence is. Now, some equate knowledge with being able to arrive at virtual certainty. And this means in some cases people think they need to hit A every time before they believe something. Of course, history and science is built on induction. And when it comes to induction, things can only arrive to a certain probability level. And so whatever claim you're going to make scientifically or historically speaking, you're probably going to be able to arrive at a probability level, as I just said. Now, Ronald Nash here in his book Faith and Reason says there's a difference between arguments on one hand and personal persuasion on the other. He says people come to their beliefs about reality and truth based upon various factors, some rational and some irrational. And just because a person is not persuaded by a given argument doesn't necessarily mean the argument is somewhat logically defective. As Nash says correctly, and I agree with him, he says non-rational factors such as ignorance, bias, self-interest, fear, or pride may stand in the way of a person genuinely understanding and feeling the full force of a powerful argument, thus being persuaded by it. And that's very important. We need to understand there is a difference between proof and persuasion. Frank Turek said in his book, I Don't Have Faith to Be an Atheist, or I'm sorry, in his book, Stealing from God, he talks about when he did a presentation once, or he has done presentations called I Don't Have Faith to Be an Atheist on college campuses. He asked people at the question and answer time if Christianity were true, would they become Christians? In many cases, the atheists say no. And Frank, of course, responds back and says, wait, you claim to be a beacon of reason, yet when I ask you if something were true, would you believe it? You say no. How is that reasonable? It's not. That's because reason or evidence isn't the issue for such people. They don't have an intellectual objection to Christianity. They have an emotional, moral, volitional objection. And in my experience, that is the case as well. Not with everybody, but it does happen sometimes. So now let's talk about volitional doubt. When it comes to volitional doubt, that has to do with your will. And that is a component of your personality that just does not naturally surrender. So you may find yourself in a crisis of belief, wondering, does God really know what's best for my life? Can I trust him to lead me in the right direction? We need to also remember all these various kinds of doubts, such as emotional, factual, and volitional. There is overlap between all of them. So we don't want to try to bracket things in only one category because people can experience all three of these things at one time. And of course, Pascal said, of faith, there's enough light for those who want to believe and of shadows to blind those who don't. He's talking about the will there. In some cases, people will not believe and they simply don't want to believe. So let me give an example here. So if you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you that exercise is good for you, you have to actually believe that this doctor's claims are true. So let's say you know it factually speaking that exercise is good for you because you believed it on an authority that your doctor told you. Number 3 here, you still have to exercise trust. Your will needs to be moved to make a commitment to exercise. So even though we have the facts sometimes, you still have to exercise our will to obey or trust what we know. In some cases, the will just doesn't want to change. We need to remember that there's a difference between skeptical doubt, antagonistic doubt, and sincere and authentic doubt. Those who hold to the latter want their doubts solved so they can go forward with God, while the former want their doubts confirmed so they can move beyond God. So we need to understand there is a difference between those two. We also need to remember the difference between knowledge, belief, and certainty. You can know something without being certain about in the presence of doubt or the admission that one might be wrong. So let me give you an example of this. Let's say you decide to get married or take a job somewhere, or you're about to make a major commitment to something. There are all kinds of life decisions where you do not have exhaustive certainty, you have gaps of knowledge, you have unanswered questions, but you still commit to make the decision. You commit to the person you marry, you commit to a job, you commit to things when there's still levels of uncertainty. And you very rarely get absolute certainty in any of those decisions. Also, number 3 here, I believe today the government won't collapse, and I believe that my friends will graduate from college and get a decent job and own a house someday. I don't have any kind of high certainty or absolute certainty, and there's gaps of knowledge and lack of certainty in those areas, but I still believe it. So sometimes people think that they have to have absolute certainty before saying they know anything, and that just doesn't work that way in life in general. You commit to things all the time with gaps of knowledge and lack and some unanswered questions. For example, right here, if I was to go over all these questions here, how do you explain these things, these features of reality, we can debate back and forth whether nature alone, which has no power to do anything, can explain all these things, or there's a mind or intelligence behind these features of reality. But in some cases, people think they've got to have every single question answered before they commit to God or who Jesus is. Skip that one. So remember, there's a common sense skepticism, which is a healthy skepticism that suspends judgment at one time or another. And then there's a hyper skepticism where they don't commit to the God question until they have exhaustive knowledge or they get every single question answered. We need to remember that God does care about the evidence that he provides because knowledge of God is an extreme transformation rather than just a spectator sport. And remember that God ultimately cares about active commitment. And in many cases, if we're not going to surrender our will, God is not required to provide more evidence. We come to know God as God becomes our God. So having said that, that about wraps up some of the basics of doubt. I hope that you understand the different forms of doubt, and I hope that you're able to work through them. Remember that many Christians have worked through issues of doubt throughout the centuries. There are resources out there. And remember that there are ways to work through these things. Remember that God can use doubts to develop us. Doubts can deepen our dependency on God. Doubts can drive us out of complacency as we eagerly search for answers. Remember that doubts can cultivate Christian humility within us as we realize that everything isn't so black and white after all. Doubts can help us relate to other doubters with more compassion, and doubts can help us grow in Christian discernment as we sift through what to believe and what not to believe. Have a good day.